Okay, so if you can remember back to this morning, what was the objective that was set for Ulysses S. Grant? What was the objective? Pardon?
Destroy the Confederate army.
Destroy the Confederate army. Who agrees with that? Hands up. Who disagrees with that? That's quite interesting. Because I would argue that crossing the James is a defeat on that, and we'll come to that. So, is it a decisive turning point? I would have a great question mark, because possibly what we're looking at is, as was described there by Rees, as one of the best operational elements, tactical victories by the Federals. One of the greatest operational achievements is actually a strategic defeat. We'll come back to that. So what we're looking at, and I couldn't reproduce this, Greg and I couldn't reproduce this, is of course, what has Grant done when he gets to the James? Well, all he's really done is he's moved down here at a cost of, what, 55,000 casualties plus, to what McClellan did at the cost of a few bootlaces. In 2 years before, McClellan moves the army down here through the peninsula, as we saw with the arrows. Unfortunately, I can't reproduce the arrows or something on the system. But effectively, what Grant has done at a cost of 55,000 casualties is what McClellan did with sweeping a few barnacles off his naval ships. So this campaign is, as was quite rightly said, about destroying Lee's army. And the only way he could do that, he felt, was through a series of campaigns. And what Richmond is, if it's not about the occupation of Richmond, Richmond is, if you like, the tethered goat. It's the element that Lee has to defend. That is what will bring him out to battle, but Richmond is not the priority. Grant and everybody else who was a general would have had training. Who would they have looked at in terms of the successful generals of the 19th century? They would have all studied Napoleon, and of course Napoleon had three major land-based enemies: Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Right? And they would have all studied that at West Point. And if you think about their campaigns, Napoleon occupies Vienna, and he then goes on and wins at Austerlitz. Right? That isn't the end of the campaign. And I think he does the same with Wagram, one of the two. But he occupies Vienna and then goes on and wins a decisive battle. He then, in terms of Berlin, he takes that after the decisive battles of Jena and Auerstadt. He goes and occupies Moscow, but that's not the end, because the Russian army retreats, and we all know what happens after that. So they'd all know that occupying your enemy's capital does not necessarily bring hostilities to a satisfactory close. You need the loss of will that goes with the occupation of the enemy's capital. And that's why I think Lincoln said, as he'd said to many other commanders before, the destruction of Lee's army brings this war to an end, not necessarily the occupation of Richmond. The problem with the Overland campaign, which has been mentioned already and has been mentioned many times, is that the rivers are lateral, generally speaking, in Virginia. So each time you're crossing a river, it's more difficult. So if you take the James example here, it's not one of our poxy little rivers we have in the UK. It's a big thing. It's a big obstacle. I remember going up to the Susquehanna River and thinking, my goodness, this is really big. In my alternative history of 1863, I get Jed Stewart, he burns all the bridges across the Susquehanna and thinks, get across that, boys, you know. But the rivers are big, and they are big obstacles offering lots of opportunities for defence. And the problem with the Overland campaign is that you've got lots of opportunities. Well, the problem for the Federals is you've got lots of opportunities for crossing rivers, or rather lots of obstacles, and the Confederates had lots of opportunities to delay you. And remember, we're all talking about tick-tock. We're talking about the countdown to the election. Because, as it says on the famous T-shirt, it's bullets for ballots. If you've got one of these 1864 T-shirts. So, crossing the river, that's a good example of it. Look at the supplies, the pontoon bridges, and the men, and of course all the mud that goes with it, as was discussed before. And of course, they could put up a pontoon bridge pretty well because they had very good engineers in the Union Army, so it wouldn't take them that long to put up a pontoon bridge. But what if you've got opposition here? Putting up a pontoon bridge ain't so easy. So if you've got the enemy on the other side, putting up a pontoon bridge under fire is well nigh impossible. And of course, you get different bridges at different points. Here you've got one with horse-drawn, and you've got sentry blocks, so that's quite well established. But you know, this is a major undertaking, and what you can see there is an old-fashioned traffic jam. You know? Logistically, becomes that much more difficult. And this is, of course, an artist impression of Grant overlooking the crossing of the James River with your steamboats and all the men and materials. This is an artist impression of it. But you can see that the logistics, but also the risks of river crossings are very large. This can go horribly, horribly wrong very easily. This is not a riskless idea. And I think to look at why we end up with this is a bit of a recapitulation of what we've been talking about before, the Overland campaign. So think about the bloody rivers that you've got to get across. You've got the Rappahannock and Rapidan, you've got the Anna, you've got the Chickahominy. That river, remember when there were huge rains in 1862, that river grows to be this bubbling, huge, impassable river, which of course gives the first chance of the 7 days to knock out the Union forces that are stranded on the north of the river. Remember, if you've got your forces on both sides, they can't support each other. So you've also got the issue, you get sudden rains, and suddenly this river is really a big obstacle to an invading army. And if you're caught on both sides, it becomes an even bigger obstacle. You've got the Chickahominy, the James, and of course finally the Appomattox. So from that point of view, it is not ideal territory if you look at this in terms of the rivers that you've got to cross in order to get to Richmond or to attack Lee's forces. This is the Rapidan, which is at the beginning, and you know, it's quite pleasant there, you know. This is from the tourist board, I think. But, you know, again, the issue, I think I got this from the tourist board, again, the issue is sudden rains and you've got an impassable torrent. We looked at that before, that's the crossing again. And let's have a look at the Rappahannock. Again, you can see lots of, it's not navigable up there, so you're not putting in, like with the Mississippi, steamboats to help you along. You are having to cross what is quite treacherous waters. And it goes further here. This is another Union pontoon bridge. And what you can see here is this is towards one of their steamboats. And then, of course, you have the North Anna. Now, I couldn't find, the North Anna, I think, is quite steep. I couldn't find something, but again, quite a nice river, very scenic. But again, I'd rather be defending than attacking on that basis. So, and then finally, the James, which of course is wide, gets wider, and is quite a difficult river to navigate. This is, however, the beach areas, you can probably see. So, again, a real obstacle. And so every time you are trying to cross a river, there is always a chance that your enemy forces, in this case the Confederates, will interfere with your plans. So let's have a look at this issue, and of course the main protagonists of Grant and Lee. And it is quite interesting, when I was looking up quotes of what Grant said about Lee and looked at his memoirs, it was quite interesting because Grant appears to have a higher impression of Joe Johnston than he does of Lee. It's quite interesting. He talks about Lee as being this austere person that everyone is in awe of, and in the same way that it was talked about before, you know, people should quit saying, what's Bobby Lee going to do? What are we going to do to him? There was quite a lot of hesitation. I know that there was respect at the end at Appomattox, but there certainly wasn't a great deal of respect at the beginning. Grant thought that Lee was unimaginative, that he was somewhat cautious, and that his reputation was, frankly, overrated. That's what he thought at the beginning. And he was disabused of this after a while during the Overland campaign. But there are occasions when you think Grant is taking risks because he thinks that Lee won't react to those risks. That, I think, is the mindset, at least at the beginning of the Overland campaign. And Lee, of course, is, as I think, running out of able lieutenants who can do some of the hard work for him. You know, a question I had at lunchtime to somebody was, you know, would the quality have increased because of greater experience, but how does that compare to the actually able people that you lose? And I think, you know, you've got a lot of discussion about Lee rushing to the front, doing this, telling people what to do, because he hasn't got the able lieutenants who should be carrying these things out. And therefore, like a boss who is overworked without being able to delegate, he's doing lots of tasks that he should not have to do. And I think that's the increasing aspect of at least the Confederacy generalship, that you're getting commanders doing things that they shouldn't have to do. And of course, if they're doing the things they shouldn't have to do, they're neglecting some of the things that they should do, which is thinking about overall strategy. As I said, what does Ulysses S. Grant say? Quit thinking about what Bobby Lee's going to do to us and start thinking about what we're going to do to him. Which you might think is hubris, but actually, given the way that other commanders in the past have been rather transfixed by Robert E. Lee, was probably one of his great contributions to Union victories. And then I love this. The art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike him as hard as you can, and keep moving on. And I don't think that you can actually encapsulate Ulysses S. Grant any better than that. But now, of course, he has the advantage of the big battalions. As we know, it's not always the case that those with the biggest battalions actually win. And then there is this quote, and I think that this is really important. We must destroy this army of Grant's before he gets to the James River, said Lee. If he gets there, it will become a siege, and then it will be a mere question of time. Think about that quote in the context of what happens afterwards. Because I think he forgets what he said, or more or less forgets what he said, or certainly doesn't act on what he said there. The other question that comes up with Grant is, in every battle there comes a time when both sides consider themselves beaten. Then he who continues the attack wins. And that's a lot about Grant's moral strength. The moral strength after the Wilderness to carry on, to move forward. And if you think about some of the decisive turning points of the Civil War, the point that he continued forward, rather unlike Joe Hooker or John Pope, who retreated, is a lot of his moral strength. Right? That he could put up with true horrific casualties, and a lot of people thinking he should retreat, and he didn't do so. He has moral strength, but it does help if you outnumber the enemy. And if you think about that, I do have the map again. All he's done, by the time he gets to Cold Harbour, is pretty much what my mate McClellan would have done, except for without a great deal of casualties. But the difference is, Grant has the moral fibre that I regret to say McClellan seemed to lack. So McClellan gets here, and interesting as a contrast, Grant is able to strip Washington of most of his men, which is why the Battle of Manassas is so important. Whereas, of course, when McClellan says and gets to within 3 miles of Richmond, and says, I need some more troops, Lincoln says, no. Right? And, when McClellan says, I will restart the offensive, Lincoln says, no, I need my troops in Washington. Whereas Lincoln's relationship with Grant is enough that he's prepared to strip Washington of the defences and, of course, nearly gets called out. And that shows a difference in relationship between the Commander-in-Chief, which is the President, and Ulysses S. Grant, as opposed to McClellan. If we look at the campaigns, and I don't want to steal anyone's thunder for tomorrow, but what we see is a series of turning movements. And although, if you like, each time, it's like one of those sort of games where you have to play a blocking movement every so often. It could be a game of drafts or chess, and all you're doing is Lee is blocking and blocking and blocking. But it's Grant who does all the really dangerous moves, most of the occasions, because he's doing an attack, a flank attack. And the obvious element that I always wonder about is when you are marching that way, why isn't Lee cutting them off as they march to the next place? Because indeed, on all of these occasions, Lee gets there just in time to stop Grant going this way, presumably towards Richmond. But at no point is he really cutting off Grant's army or trying to bisect it or cut its supplies, because a flank attack is incredibly dangerous. Right? And this is the story all the way down here. But the point would be is that the story of the Overland campaign is that on each occasion when they come up head to head, Grant is unable to destroy Lee's army. Both armies get weaker, but proportionally the Confederates get weaker still. And Grant still has the luxury of numbers. I mean, he loses in this campaign 55,000 troops, casualties, which is pretty much the same as Lee's army was to start with. He has the luxury of continuous reinforcements. And Cold Harbour is, of course, the culmination of that. That is his final attempt at a frontal assault in order to destroy Lee's army. And when that fails with allegedly 7,000 casualties in half an hour, Grant does what he did again when it came to Vicksburg. He thinks, I'm going to try a different tactic. And the tactic obviously is to move across the James, right? Masking his movements, but moves across the James and establishes himself south of Richmond, attacking Petersburg. Now, that could be seen as actually a strategic defeat, because he's given up the idea that he's going to be able to crush Lee's army. Well, certainly not for quite some time, because it's a siege against fortifications, and having failed to take Petersburg, of course, we know that the Confederates hold out for about 9 months, which is way past election time. So, you think of retreating Joe Johnston, what about retreating Bobby Lee? And generally speaking in this, we get a clash of armies with the Federals suffering more casualties, partly because they're an attacking force, and partly because their commander-in-chief seems to be quite relaxed about suffering more casualties. He's not taking the political flak, it's Lincoln who's taking the political flak. What then happens is they disengage, the Federals try to outflank, the Confederates meet the threat, and it's always further south. So there's a pattern to what is going on. And of course, continuously crossing the rivers. So, if you look at the butcher's bill for this, and it's quite interesting because I was reading Grant's memoirs and he gets a figure around 33,000. I think he was talking to Gouverneur K. Warren at this point. Yeah, you know. But the butcher's bill for it, Wilderness, Spotsylvania, North Anna, Cold Harbour, nearly 55,000, which, as I say, is about the number of troops that Robert E. Lee starts with. And he's prepared to pay that price. No one should say that generalship is an easy ride, because you have to live with that for the rest of your life. I mean, I compare it to Retreating Joe, who, remember, was, we're going to get into trouble because someone's going to say, well, what's Retreating Joe got to do with the Overland campaign? But Retreating Joe did something very similar. He built strong defences, Sherman flanks, turns the line, threatens Confederate lines, and Johnson retreats. And that is the general message of the Georgia campaign. The difference, I think, with Retreating Joe is that there are occasions, as has been evidenced today, when Lee does decide to attack, does go in and change what he just does change the narrative by going in for various attacks when he considers that the Federals are isolated. But what I would say is that I think the Lee of 1864 is less likely to take risks. The Lee of Chancellorsville is only seen occasionally. Normally it appears to be reaction to the Federals, not a question of, can I isolate an element and defeat it in detail? There is a lot less of that, I think, and that may be partly because obviously he's not always a well person, we know that. At Gettysburg he wasn't well, there are times in the Overland campaign he's not that well, but also he's running out of dependable lieutenants, you know. He loses, he's lost Jackson obviously, his old warhorse Longstreet almost lost in the same way and out of action. He doesn't have the people who can carry out complex orders in a consistent manner. Ewell has his good days and he has his bad days, you know. He's a human being. But my point would be is that it is maybe slightly unfair to compare Lee to Retreating Joe, but I do think you see a lot less of the Lee that is prepared to really take the offensive against the odds, as he did in 7 days. He saw the opportunity of the Chickahominy River swollen. He can hit the northern side of the Chickahominy, and he writes, in ordinary circumstances, the army would have been destroyed. Whose fault was it? It wasn't destroyed, anybody? Jackson's fault, right? So even the best can fail. Jackson has a really bad time around the Chickahominy. He obviously doesn't like that part of Virginia. He's much better up in the north, you know. You don't like swampland. But my point would be that, you know, he uncovers pretty much Richmond in order to hit there. He takes a risk that McClellan will go forward, but he doesn't, right? And he's able to hit the Federals enough that they panic and retreat. He does that in 1862. We all know what he does in 1863 with Chancellorsville, where he leaves a very thin line at Fredericksburg, does the flank attack. Could have been disastrous, but he takes those risks. You see a commander who takes less risks in 1864. And you could say that actually that sort of maneuver should allow him, at least at some points, to think, do you know what? They're going to, if he believes his words that they're going to create a siege at Richmond and there's only one result, this is the point at which you think, I've got to take some risks. Okay. So, this is Retreating Joe. Sorry, I won't do too many maps because somebody complained. Honestly, that's not on the Overland, and this isn't either. But you can see a similar situation with Retreating Joe, where he moves from place to place until Jefferson Davis gets fed up with it. But look, each time there's a flank movement point, moves him out of a very good position. I mean, Greg and I went to Kennesaw Mountain. I'm thinking to myself, how on earth do you get people out of Kennesaw Mountain when you flank them? But the point would be is, surely you should be sending troops, because when they're marching, they're more vulnerable. Never does it. Of course, the real issue is Cold Harbor is the final throw of the dice to destroy Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And I think it would be fair to say, in the inimitable words of the Japanese emperor, it did not necessarily go in our favour. Right? 7,000 casualties in 30 minutes. The Confederates certainly knew how to entrench. And, you know, a bit like with Ian and Greg, I put a little paper saying what my name is, should I collapse in here? But it was certainly the case that the troops on the ground were putting papers in their tunics so that, because they thought they weren't going to get out of it alive. And of course, they knew more than their commanders. So, having failed to destroy Lee's army, he then, you think about it, the casualties, as I said, at the end, by the time you get to the end of Cold Harbor, is about 55,000, whereas the Army of Northern Virginia casualties are about 32,000. Proportionately, you're in striking range of each other. So what about the James River, the crossing? Now, in my view, I think other people might agree, it's one of the great achievements. Yeah? What he's done, remember, what did he say? One of the things he said, in every battle there comes a time when both sides consider themselves beaten. Then he who continues the attack wins. But what he didn't do was just attack another day and attack another day. He changed his strategy. He changed his strategy and said, right, I'm going to go down here and see if I can outflank Lee that way. Now, the James River, as you can see even here, is not exactly an easy undertaking, not without risk. He's just suffered a real shattering blow, but Grant recovers his poise and is able to think like a commander-in-chief and says, right, I'm going to go and do something different. And my real query on this is, what is Robert E. Lee doing at this point, right? Because they send a lot of troops and Lee does nothing. Let me remind you, and these are my rules on tactics, right? Okay? Frontal attacks rarely work, right? Yeah, there are some examples. Possibly, you know, what are we looking at? Chattanooga, they race up the hill by the Union in November 1863. The fight across the clouds, that worked. Flanking attacks tend to work pretty well, right? The success rate of flanking attacks is much higher. Well-entrenched infantry are very, very difficult to dislodge, particularly if they're not raw troops, right? You know, and by this point, the Confederate Army knows its business in terms of entrenchments. And victory disorganizes armies almost as much as defeat, right? How many times have we seen one side or the other gain some form of advantage and then throw it away? Plenty of time. My question is always, why did the American Civil War last 4 years? Well, because neither side could really take advantage of a victory to really push on and deal a decisive blow. They could win tactically, they rarely won something that was operational or strategic. And I think it does come back to von Moltke's ideas of the Civil War being two mobs fighting each other, which may seem slightly unfair. And normally I don't take quotes from the Germans except for when it comes to military stuff, where they do know a bit. They also know about how to run a car, how to build a car. But, you know, military stuff, they do know something about it. But I think the Civil War shortcomings were appalling staff work. I mean, really dreadful staff work most of the time. And you could argue, is that because the commanders don't put enough emphasis on the importance in staff work, or maybe people of ability actually just wanted to fight rather than, you know, man the guns. You know, in stress, what do? I end up manning a gun or wanting to lead people. I don't want to do staff work, right? That appears to be the case. And the part staff work is truly awful, particularly on the Confederate side. Opportunity are very rarely fully exploited. There are very few occasions I can think of where you win a victory and you absolutely roll up the enemy to an extent that you've won a strategic and operational victory. And therefore victories that are achieved through blood are rarely decisive. Fredericksburg, think of Chancellorsville, think of Gettysburg the other way. In other words, victories rarely lead to anything other than a renewed stalemate. Let's go back to the story here, post-Cold Harbor. I'm sorry, I've spelt it the wrong way, I've spelt it the American way.
That's the correct one.
Oh, well, you know. Well, I am talking about a place, so it's, you know, proper nouns, so I'll leave it at that. Grant was preparing to transfer his army to the South Bank. What does Lee do? He doesn't think about, what's he going to do next? If I was in Grant's shoes, what will I do next? Given that he said how important it is to stop the Northern Army getting to the James, he isn't thinking, well, you know, we stopped them several times. If I was Grant, and we know he's no fool, what might he think about? He just sticks there. Warren crosses the Chickahominy at Long Bridge on 12th of June at the night, and Wright and Burnside, okay, it's Burnside, but, you know, move a more circuitous route, obviously further away. Wright is masking the movement. He moves quietly at night. Then you get, on the outside, you get, Warren moves on the inside track. Then you get Wright and Burnside moving. And for goodness sake, you've got Burnside moving. You know. Gosh, I mean, we're not talking genius there, are we? Oh, you know, and he doesn't. It manages to work. They get across the James. So you get Smith calls to the White House. He embarks on the transports down the York, up the Bermuda Hundred to join that other hero of the Civil War, Butler. Can you imagine? You put Butler there, still around, still not doing very much. So if you think about it, this is a huge operation, and I hope the pictures showed beforehand how big it was. So is it a huge achievement? And I think it is. I think it's a very big tactical achievement by Grant. And if you think about, I don't know, we're going to move forward on the Overland campaign, yeah, fine. But this is an operation which is conceived quickly in the wake of a catastrophic tactical defeat, and he turns the table to a certain extent on Lee. Lee still thinks that Grant wants to attack north of the James, right? Stays completely impassive, then abandons his position, and then falls back to Richmond, and eventually, at the very last minute, reinforces Petersburg, although you know, it really is touch and go. I mean, if I contrast that to his performance at the 7 Days, where he hits, as I say, north of the river, or his performance at Manassas 2, where he's prepared to send Jackson's force up north, hugely outnumbered, with a possibility that he could be overwhelmed. Now, I know it's against John Pope, so it's quickly. But, you know, he takes a huge risk at Manassas because he sent his troops, he split them up. At Chancellorsville, he splits them up 3 ways. But what you see is a differently, maybe worn down by another year of conflict and illness, and the lack of reliable lieutenants, who isn't prepared to split up in the same way that he did before. So, if you ask and you look at why does Lee remain impassive, well, part of it is they say he's overstretched. Okay, it's true. He has less troops, but he does have interior lines, and of course, you have to, it is always said, to govern is to choose. Yeah? And you've got to choose. You can't just remain impassive unless you're prepared to be on the defensive all the time and let your opponents do all of the running. He said that the lines could extend no further. But again, you've got to look at the risks. If the Federals had been that a little bit quicker, they'd have had Petersburg with all the railway lines, game over in terms of Richmond. And of course, unwilling to leave fortifications. So you get this, whereas the early Lee dug fortifications in 1862, he was seen as the King of Spades, with a view to being able to release people to attack. Here he's staying in his fortifications, nice and snug in them. Well, that's what he thinks. So the early Lee used fortifications to allow him to release troops to be aggressive, whereas the later Lee seems to be unwilling to leave those fortifications. You then get the race to Petersburg, of course, and remember the Federals are going on the outside, the Confederates on the inside, and the Federals get there first. Yeah, but inevitably, staff work, hesitations, they don't take advantage of the possibility of almost walking into Petersburg. The Confederates reinforce, and therefore siege warfare ensues. And what you can see is that the Confederates get there by the skin of their teeth. The Federals miss a golden opportunity to shorten the war. If we think about Petersburg, the 5th Corps assault on the 18th of June, that's why I say it's not Waterloo, what you can see is the final assault there of the main battles, and the Confederates have sufficient troops in there to resist, and therefore the thin red line does manage to hold out. So, when I look at that, what you can see is, again, the Federals have done the hard work. They've crossed the river. They've lost nobody crossing the river. The Confederates have remained completely passive. The Federals get round to Petersburg. And the interesting element, again, if you're thinking about poor staff work, nobody on either side, until they get into battle, realises how important Petersburg is, with all the rail lines and the supply lines. After all, when Petersburg falls in April 1865, the Confederates have to leave. And what I've read shows that neither side was really that cognizant of the importance of Petersburg until they really start fighting there. So that's, if you like, the final throw to get a decisive result in June 1864. And of course we then do get the crater, another example of something that was greatly planned, didn't work, but at least gave us a very, very good film with some fantastic acting. I think there's a copy of the video over there with Nicole Kidman in it.
Cold Mountain.
Cold Mountain, yes, it's a brilliant film. And Nicole Kidman is just fantastic. Anyway. You know, it's not Waterloo. The thin red line does hold, but it's not a decisive victory yet again. And this time, the Federals fluff their lines. So the results are Petersburg is not taken. but there is a siege. And it is the end game if the election is won by Lincoln. But this is my final twist. I think that the crossing of the James, as I said, is one of Grant's greatest achievements. Right? You've got to go back to some of the things he did in Vicksburg, around Vicksburg, which brought his surrender. But generally speaking, I think it's one of the greatest achievements of Grant. But actually, it's a bit of a tactical defeat. Because if you think, what is the major thing in 1864? Election, right? At the point Grant is stuck at Petersburg, what does Lincoln say about his chances of re-election?
Zilch.
Zilch, Cornish, as the Germans might have said. But he doesn't have a chance of being re-elected. So Petersburg is not the election-winning thing. There's no point having a siege that's going to last 9 months if it's 3 months or 4 months to the election and you're going to lose it, right? The actual breaking of the deadlock does not occur as a result of the Overland campaign. It occurs because Sherman takes Atlanta and the aforementioned ghastly Sheridan beats the Confederates in the Shenandoah, including, of course, at Cedar Creek. So if you think to yourself, there is stalemate in front of Petersburg, and what delivers the election for Lincoln isn't to do with Petersburg, it's to do with other theatres, secondary theatres, Shenandoah, which is nice and close to Washington, and the Sherman taking Atlanta. And so my thought is that the 55,000 federal casualties, 33,000 Confederate casualties, and you end up with a stalemate there. And the war is decided elsewhere. Thank you very much.